About your presence at this 20-year conference that surveys the Romanian film, I would like to ask you to very briefly explain what you talked about in the conference. What was your approach to it?
I mean, what I did was simply survey a number of different authors in Romanian film and looked at why there were relatively few kind of authors in the sense of people who have who develop a kind of signature style. I mean, obviously that's to do with funding, as we've just been talking about, and the pressures that are put on filmmakers by companies like Arte or whatever to compromise the vision, but also, I mean, also the willingness of filmmakers to compromise themselves and, you know, make films that are telling you what they think, not showing you what they found in the world. So that's what I talked about a number of different authors in that context and the difficulties that Romanian filmmakers face, mostly because of the funding and distribution problems.
Yeah. I think it's very important to ask you that. What is your opinion? What is the next step in Romania towards doing good authored documentary films? Because you also have this inside and also this outside review.
Well, I'm sure having a proper film training program. I mean, that's the, you know, I'm sure there are lots of young people who would happily do this and would be interested in doing it. But you need to have training programs, and then you need to invite good teachers and build. I mean, and there are already some people who can teach on programs like that in Romania. But you need to invite. I mean, so for instance, I mean, Karciu teaches film in Glasgow. He doesn't teach film in Bucharest. I mean, it's idiotic. I mean, he teaches film in Glasgow part-time, so he could equally well teach film in Budapest part-time. But others as well, but also non-Romanians could come. But you'd need, I mean, that would be the obvious thing to do, is to build a film school.
Right.
And that would change things a lot, I think. I mean, there's a real, I mean, I'm sure in Romania, as elsewhere, there's much more demand for these films than people imagine. So that, you know, I mean, the English people haven't changed in 20 years, but now, documentary feature films, most weeks in cinemas, there's one documentary feature on. Not every week, but maybe the majority of weeks in a year. And that's completely, 20 years ago, it just wasn't like that. You couldn't see documentaries in the cinema. So people now go to documentary in cinema because the cinemas realise there's a market. And that's not because people have really changed. It's because there's more supply. So you can change things by increasing the supply. You can, but also, I mean, there's a question about developing, you know, the internet market, and that's partly a cultural change, getting people to accept that you have to pay €2 to watch a film. But, you know, once you break through that, and once they start paying €2, you get 1,000 views. That's, you know, you've enough money to begin the next project. Right. I mean, because these things are now relatively, I mean, so much cheaper than they used to be.
Yeah, and there's also these crowdfunding campaigns which are amazing.
And perhaps in Romania might be more successful in a funny way because people understand there's less sort of central funding. They work quite hard in Europe. I mean, in Britain at least, it's difficult to get funding.
Right. I know you run a festival which was basically inspired in some ways by Astra Film and
that's right.
Present here. What's the importance of Astra Film Festival in this paysage of festivals in Romania?
Well, it got in Romania. I mean, it was the first big film festival. I mean, it existed, you know, long before TIFF, and also it built up in a much more difficult environment. So Sibiu is a less rich city than Cluj, and documentary is a harder sell than fiction film. I mean, which is not to say, I mean, TIFF has been brilliant. I mean, incredibly well organised, very, very well managed. It's a really important festival internationally. But so has Astra. I mean, there were the big ones already. There was Sheffield was becoming bigger at the time. But what Astra was one of the first ones to really say, apart from maybe one or two in France, to really say that the point of this festival is not the industry, but is to have meetings of filmmakers and students, and that the point is to create a culture of documentary film in Romania. So that was really new. And I mean, in Hungary since then there have been much smaller and not so well organised festivals. So in Eastern Europe, I mean, Jiklub is the big industry festival, and it's very, very good and has good programming, but it's a completely different sort of thing because it's so much more industry oriented. And of course, it's in the Czech Republic, it receives much more support from the central government than this does. So it's also, I mean, it's also a kind of potential inspiration to other festivals of how you might do this. And so the other thing to say is that it's very much, I mean, the festival here is a festival. It's a celebration. I mean, there's music, there's always other activities. There's a lot of space given to kind of talk. And so that's, again, different. And I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that, I've met people here who aren't from Eastern Europe, but who I've met through having come here. So Leonard Reto-Helmrich from Indonesia, Holland and Indonesia, I made friends with here, etc. I mean, many others, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that position.
Absolutely. How's the audience here in the Astra Film Festival?
It's good, I think. I mean, look, I've not been this year in so many Q&A sessions, but the audience is very alert. People don't leave; they stay. It's a very, it varies. I mean, there's a huge junior audience this year. I mean, it's extraordinary to see so many young people coming, being brought by their schools and so on. But it's a young, very kind of vibrant audience. So it's good.
Yeah, I think Astra in the last years, I mean, gathering this whole archive of films made about Romania and also international wide, has turned somehow, as you well said, into this almost research center for educating audiences and educating young people that are dealing with documentary and inspiring them.
That's right.
Can you emphasize a bit on this matter?
Yeah, I mean it's trivial in a way, but it's important that you couldn't run a film school unless you have a very good archive. I mean, because the main way you learn how to make films is by watching and studying how other people made films and shaping your taste that way. So yeah, no, it's a fantastic collection of films that have been built up here. So not just of Romanian, but of films from all over the world. And it's a shame in a way that it's not used more by being part of a film school or bigger. I mean, it's used, of course, during the festival, and people can come to it. It's a very open resource, and all the screenings elsewhere, etc., that are organised in other cities, you make use of it, but it could be used more in training context. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been here 20 years now in this festival. How do you see Astra Film in 20 years now?
I don't know. I don't know how. I mean, I think these live festivals, the more people do on the internet, the more value there is to these live festivals. And I hope it will be. I hope somehow or other they will find a more stable form of funding, so that they can know long in advance what they can do and what they can't do each year. So that's really a problem. That they only know their final budget up to maybe 2 weeks before the festival, which means they can't invite people or whatever. I mean, that's a real. Running a festival, I know how important these issues of the timing of funding are. And so maybe that would be very nice to think that will be resolved. Yeah. But Dimitri will only be 70-something, so I'm sure he'll still be running it.
Of course. He's full of life, yeah, sure. I have one more question about you run a festival in London, and you probably screen some Romanian films over there, documentary films. How do people react to Romanian documentary cinema outside the country?
Certainly when we showed The Curse of the Hedgehog, which we closed, the first edition of the festival, the closing gala was that film. People loved it. I mean, there was a real... people didn't know at all, what they were going to meet. And there was a lot of goodwill to the festival. People had thought this is, you know, a lovely thing to have in London. But this film was a kind of real surprise. But a bit like, you know, like Puyu's The Death of Lazarescu came as a real surprise to British audiences. But equally, I mean, you know, the film's 4 months, 3 days, and the film, I've forgotten its title that came out this year. Sorry?
Beyond the Hills?
Beyond the Hills, exactly, yeah. So those, I mean, there's a kind of quite a lot of willingness of people to go and see Romanian film, and to know that Romanian cinema is something worth kind of, you know, finding out about. So no, I mean, the films that we've shown have gone down very well with audiences. I mean, much appreciated.
I have a very silly last question. What is documentary film? Very, very briefly.
I mean, the answer that I like most is the documentary film. I mean, there are many sorts of documentary, yeah. And so, but the kind of documentary film that I like particularly is one where you're often asking the question. You find yourself asking the question: what's the relationship between what you're seeing on the screen and what people call the pro-filmic? So, you know, what was going on actually in the space when the film was being made, yeah? And if, you know, in a feature film, you don't ask that question. I mean, or you do if you're studying it in a class, but nobody else apart from film students asks that question. I mean, film studies students don't ask that because they're only interested in the narrative of the film. But so for technicians teaching, how do you light a sequence? How do you shoot day for night or whatever? Yeah, you know, we'll watch that, yeah? But in a documentary, that sort of question, in the documentaries that I like, that sort of question is completely fundamental. But there are other documentaries, you know, news programs, investigations, where those issues are much less important. And but those are just, you know, those are also very good documentaries. Yeah? So, yeah.
What Romanian documentaries are the ones that remain in your memory and are significant for you? 2 or 3 titles and why?
You mean from the past 20 years?
Yes.
Well, I suppose one would be Bleste Mulăriciului, obviously by Budrala, because, you know, obviously I'm interested in that because, you know, I'm interested in films about Roma, but, you know, that is the best documentary film about Roma anywhere made, I think. So that's really a great film. That's very enjoyable. In fact, you know, as ethnography as well, as anthropology, it's very, very good. And then another film which I think is really good is După Revoluție by Calciu, partly because it was made before he had any training. It was filmed before he had any training, and that was very interesting to see what he did just spontaneously. And also because it captures lots of the essence of that period. I mean, partly the arguments people had in the streets, the kind of popular democracy that took place, partly the sort of mad atmosphere of a kind of paranoid country after a revolution, lots of strange beliefs, but partly also there's this sequence they film in a press conference with the old communists, Iliescu and that awful Roman, Petru Roman. I mean, sort of monsters, really. But what's fun is that the atmosphere of the conference is incredibly relaxed, and it's inconceivable that nowadays it would be anything like that. And so it captures a moment in history very, very nicely. And then more recently, there's this film, Theodora, the Sinner, which is also a really great film. I mean, really beautifully filmed, but I think also a really, really good film about the experience of becoming a nun and the paradox of giving up your body, but the only way to do that is in a kind of bodily way. And so she captures that fascinating paradox in Christianity, but without any, you know, she's not telling you that, she's showing it you in the film. So those are the 3 maybe that stick with me. I mean, there are lots of other good ones, but those 3.
I know you know these, most of the Romanian cinema production in the last 20 years because you've been a friend of the festival for so many years, from the beginning actually. What kind of themes, subjects would you like to see being approached in the future documentary production in Romania?
Well, what there's not, I mean, for instance, I mean, although there are some films which broach this subject, funnily, there isn't a good film telling the story of the reproduction of the communist elite. I mean, in the sense of really good journalism, of how, I mean, of course, there's, you know, I mean, there's capitalism, our improved formula, which tells part of the story. And there are other ones, you know, maybe Balkan Champion also has an element from the Hungarian side. But there isn't a kind of film which really takes you through what happened and the complexities of what happened. So there's kind of really interesting history to be done. And there's probably also, I mean, bizarrely, there aren't proper history films about the communist period made. I mean, there are films made, but the history in them is a bit weak. Or they're made in a very televisual, kind of boring fashion. But also there's lots and lots of subjects in Romania that just aren't covered or done in a very sentimental way. So you know, there's a whole world, I'm sure, to explore. But I mean, equally, you know, I mean, this new film about Transnistria, I mean, that, you know, that you were involved in. That, I mean, it's odd that it's taken 25 years to make a proper film about this subject. Well, okay, so 15 years since the documents were published. So it was relatively easy after that to think about how you might structure a film and so on. But it took a long time for it to happen. So there's also, I mean, you know, if you think about what an interesting place Romania is and how diverse it is, it's surprising how few films come out. So of documentary form, yeah.